spices and ones that have nothing to do with it. And then, of all people, a Samaritan comes by and helps him. Now, when you read it in the original context, it's like, here's a Jewish guy, no Jew will help him, but of all people, a Samaritan will help him. You believe it's someone who hates the Jews, he's the one who helps them. So that's where we get this concept of the good Samaritan. The underlining should be on the word Samaritan. You would expect a Jew to help him, but in fact, this
What the Cushing black?
no, you think of the Kushin. They're just regular olive skin like that's Kush. Kush is Ethiopia. So like Sipora, for example, Moshe's wife is called the Kush, the African. The Japanese actually. I've never heard that. Japanese might be surrounded. That's so weird. Samurai. Samurai. Oh, look at that. That's fascinating. I would never have thought that. Anyways, the Samaritans then and now actually they practice their rituals on Har Gerizim, which is near Shechem in modern Israel, and they practice sacrifices just like they would in the temple. He criticizes their pronunciation. They don't use the letter A or I-N. They say everything with an olive. He makes fun of that. And then he goes on. He tells us a little about Jerusalem. Describes there are 400 nights. It was held by the Crusaders at this time. There are 400 nights that are there. That there are hospitals there for the veterans who are wounded and so on. And he has a very beautiful and detailed, moving description of the city of Jerusalem. He talks about the Kotel. He talks about the stables of King Solomon, and exactly as we have it today. It's quite fascinating. He also describes Kever Rachel and the Ma'arat HaMachpelah. The latter is especially fascinating. He describes how for a bride you could get down into the actual caves, and there were inscriptions on each of the graves and so on. More detail than tourists today can't see, but it's clear. It's a real reinforcement of the historical significance of many of these locations that are revered to this day, 1,000 years later. He also moves on to Babylon, and he's especially interested in all of the cities mentioned in the Talmud, and they're really quite thriving as Jewish population centers. He describes the political conflicts of the exilarchates. We talked about them last week with the Karaites, right, the Reish Galusa, and so on. He talks about the honor showed to the Reish Galusa by the non-Jewish population, that they're required by state law to non-Jews must stand in the presence of the head of the Jewish community and so on. And he describes quite a bit of interesting data about how the Jewish community is organized, that the Reish Galuta is the one who confirms the appointment, the ordination of local rabbis, that he's responsible for collecting taxation and dispersing it for social welfare and so on. And also that the Reish Galuta, as the descendant of King David, actually receives foreign donations from far-off populations as well. A tremendous amount of really great, interesting demographic data. Shushan is a particularly interesting town. There he describes a Jewish machlokas, a Jewish controversy over the bones of the prophet Eliah, which apparently were buried originally on one side of this river, and the Jews living on that side of the river were very wealthy. So the Jews on the other side of the river maintain the only reason they're wealthy is because they have the privilege of living in proximity to the bones of the prophet Eliah. So therefore they petitioned successfully to have the bones transferred to their side of the river, and they have an agreement where every year they would move the bones of the prophet from one side of the river to the other in order to spread the wealth, distribute the wealth, I guess, like that. So they would move, and so this went on for quite a while until the Persian Empire, the emperor himself was traveling through. He saw what was going on. He also revered the bones of Daniel, but he thought that it was disrespectful to exhume him and transport him like that. So he said, no, we're going to do this differently. He had him encased in a glass coffin and suspended from the middle of the bridge between the two settlements. So that way, it was like equidistant, it was fair, and they could both share in the riches, but fishing from the bridge was prohibited from them on, because that was considered, inappropriate. That's why they have those signs here in Florida, fishing from bridge, in memory of, that's better than the jokes we started with. Also interesting, he has it's the first reference of any kind to the false Messiah David Alroy, a fascinating individual. We just know little snippets of him, but apparently he was something of a wonder worker that claimed to be the Mashiach who would lead all the Jews back to Israel. He was a bit of an irritant to local status quo in many ways. He was challenging the traditional centers of power. So he was actually captured by the Persian king and imprisoned, and then miraculously somehow escaped. And then when he escaped, he kept on maintaining that he was in fact the Messiah. And he practiced various wonders, like he had the original invisibility shawl. Or in Harry Potter, he would put the shawl around him and he would disappear. It was also useful as a mode of transport because he could lay it on water and walk on his own carpet on the water, and people were totally amazed at this. Ultimately, both the XLR, the Reish Galusa, and the head of the yeshiva disavowed him and said he is not the Mashiach, we don't want anything to do with him, he's a troublemaker, and so on. And so the king's forces put out a fatwa, and he was assassinated in his bed one night. This is like the first reference we have to the kind of antinomian religious life of Jews at the time. And he finds all kinds of other interesting, bizarre Jews from Karaites. He also finds a group of Jews in the island of Cyprus who observe Shabbat from Saturday morning at dawn until Sunday morning at dawn. Completely out of step with everybody else. But that would be like Saturday morning. Yeah, we would free up Friday night, but we would lose Mostly Shabbos. Yeah, like when we should done anyways, it didn't last long. Obviously, we want our Saturday nights. There are some descriptions towards the end of his itinerary, far off lands that he probably never visited, like China and so on. The language changes and he talks about them. But he does have some interesting references to Eastern Europe, places like Kiev and Prague, he apparently visited, and everything, kinds of material there that are fascinating to scholars. So, just to conclude, I wanted to show you this last map to a sense of what's going to happen in the very near future after Benjamin Tuvel's travels. You begin to see Ashkenaz growing and changing as the Jews from Germany in particular begin to make their move towards the east. Benjamin Tuvel is perhaps one of the most famous of the wandering Jews, but he's certainly not the first and far from the last. As the Jewish population begin to move from the central regions of like Speyer and Mainz into Eastern Europe, where they have an entirely new economic reality awaiting for them there. And we'll return to that in a later lecture. So with that, I'd like to conclude for tonight. Thank you very much for your attention. Hello and welcome to another edition of This Week in Jewish History. Today we're going to speak about an extremely consequential Jewish astronomer and historian named Abraham Zacuto. His role in Jewish history is especially important this week because we're commemorating the anniversary of Columbus's departure from Spain for the New World, and Zacuto's work was of signal importance in getting Columbus to the New World. So let's have a quick look at his life and work. So Zacuto his family originally came from Castile, and they migrated to Spain. Zacuto received his education at the University of Salamanca, and he spent much of his time studying astronomy in particular, although a good deal of his training was especially in the Jewish sciences, the study of Torah in particular. One of his teachers, besides his father, was the great Rabbi Abuab, the author of the Menorah HaMaor, very important Kabbalistic work.
he made his claim to fame primarily with the Chibur Hagadol, which is a translation of the term the big book, the great book, which is essentially a collection of highly accurate astronomical tables, which was later translated into non-Jewish languages and played an important role in a lot of the exploration that happened in the late 15th century. Columbus himself owned a copy of the Chibur Hagadol in obviously a language that he could read, and we have his marginal notations on the side, and he directly credits Zacuto with an exceptional event in his memoirs when he describes how he was taken captive by natives of some type at one point and was threatened with death until he used Zacuto's timetables to be able to accurately predict an eclipse, which of course demonstrated his superior knowledge and so on and allowed him to be saved. Zacuto's work also played an extremely important part in the travels of Vasco da Gama, and particularly his improvement of the engineering of the astrolabe, which was a device that was originally made out of wood. Zacuto switched to metals and also calibrated in such a way that it was possible to actually calculate one's position at sea far more accurately than had ever been done before, and ultimately led to the circumnavigation of the globe. Zacuto was, of course, highly regarded in his own lifetime for his astronomical work. He was the astronomer to the King of Portugal, actually. After he had been, along with the other Jews, expelled from Spain in 1492, he resided in Portugal. He is justly credited with the many great discoveries of that great age of exploration. One of the modern recognitions is the fact that a crater on the moon has been named after him. However, his life did not end well in Portugal. He was exiled from there as well, along with the expulsion of all Jews in 1497. He made his way with great difficulty to Tunis and then eventually to the Holy Land, where he is believed to have passed away in the year 1515. One of the most important aspects of Zacuto's work outside of his astronomy was the compilation of an amazing book called Sefer Yuchasin, which is a truly phenomenal 15th century history book that gives us tremendous insight into Jewish history as a whole. Well, that's it for this week in Jewish history. I hope you found this interesting, and I wish you an excellent week. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another essential lecture in Jewish history. Today we're going to focus on a very important aspect of Jewish intellectual history. We're going to look at the period known as the period of the Rishonim, or the first ones. It's an exceptionally important aspect of understanding how Jewish intellectual history develops and how really the massive corpus of rabbinic literature works by understanding what exactly was this period of the Rishonim. So let's go straight to the present. Here we go. Here's a basic fundamental idea that is deeply ingrained in the Jewish psyche and is very much a relevant aspect of contemporary Jewish hermeneutics, particularly within the traditional Orthodox way of looking at the universe. Specifically, there is this idea known as the Yeridas Hadoros, or decline of the generations. There is this concept that from the moment that God gave the Torah to the Jews on Mount Sinai, it's been all downhill. As my father used to say all the time, Henry, it just gets worse. So the idea is that on Sinai, the Jews reached a spiritual peak, and their sensitivity to the divine message was at its highest. And as the Talmud says, the Midrash actually, at Sinai, even the lowest household servants saw things that even the great prophet Ezekiel did not see. But ever since then, we have been slowly losing that ability to be sensitive to the divine message. We have been losing our level of spiritual ability to understand the meaning of these classical texts and so on, and we've been struggling to try and tread water all the way along. That does not mean that our intellectual skills have diminished, and in fact, this is not trying to go off on a great digression here, but when it comes to halakhic decisions, that is, decisions referring to Jewish law, one must follow contemporary opinions, even though the earlier opinions tremendous weight of being from an early generation. That said, it's not exactly a steady slope downward. It's kind of like stepped plateaus. And the Jewish religious and intellectual tradition generally recognizes several key periods of Jewish spiritual decline, and they correspond to, let's say, the following four periods that I've outlined on this slide. There is the period known as the period of the Amoraim, or the speakers. This refers to the era in which the Talmud was written, roughly the 3rd through the 6th centuries, give or take 100 years. Following the period of the Amoraim are the Geonim, which is a difficult term to translate. It's based on the word pride, so I've given the definition here of prides, but really it means like glorious ones or great ones, that kind of thing. You may have heard the term the Gaon of Vilna or the Vilna Gaon. That's the correct usage of the term. It's a title for Rabbi Eliyahu of Vilnius. But that term is used anachronistically. He was so great, he was like one of the Gaonim, even though he lived, over a century later, or almost a century later. No, actually over a century. And then we have the period that we'll talk about today. That is of the Rishonim, the first ones. The word Rishon usually means first, and that spans roughly 900 to 1500. Although there's some, kind of pedantic dispute over exactly when that period begins and when it ends. And then finally, the period of the Acharonim, the later ones, which goes up to roughly the year 1900, and it has not yet been determined. What do we call contemporary 20th or 21st century thinkers? But that's kind of like the nature of Jewish history. The arc of Jewish history, as they say, is long, and these things will be studied over time. So let's focus in on point number 3, the period of the Rishon. The names, if you've had any familiarity with the Jewish religious tradition, you'll certainly recognize them. There are perhaps a few dozen, maybe 100 at most, authors who correspond to this title of Rishonim, but to choose 3 of the most famous, there are, of course, Rashi, Rabbi Shlomo Yitzhaki, who lived in the 11th century. Here is an extremely accurate picture of Rashi. I'm just kidding, we have no idea if this is accurate, but it's a representation that's often used in iconic form. And I'll speak in the next slide a little bit about what was the kind of work that Rashi did. Secondly, the incomparable Maimonides, known by the acronym of his name, Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon. He lived in the following century, the 12th century. Here is another equally accurate rendition. I really like this one, especially with kind of like the view of the background. We have no idea if the Rambam looked like this, but nevertheless, this is sort of like the iconic image that you'll see all over Israel and things like that. And finally, not a single individual, rather a school of Rishonim known as Tosafot, which means literally additions, and that's referring to their contribution as additional to the work of Rashi. So if we look, for example, here at a page of Talmud, this is a great page, just taken off the web, it's colorized here. Let's walk through it very quickly, we'll see where they fit in. So the sort of coral color number 1 in the center is the Mishnah. This is the first page of Tractate Brachot, and we spoke about the Mishnah in an earlier essential lecture. Then directly below it in the center of the page, number 2 in yellow, that is the Gemara or Talmud per se. That is the commentary on the Mishnah. And then the blue on the right, number 3, that is the commentary of Rashi. And if you look closely, you'll see that in this particular printing, this looks like the Talmud edition, some passages are bolded and some are not bolded. They are written in the characteristic italic font that has been associated with Rashi ever since. It's known as Rashi script, although it was just a common font used, typescript and hand script written in the medieval period. Anyways, sorry for that digression. You'll see that some passages are bolded and others are not in bold and regular font. This gives you an indication as to what Rashi is doing. The bolded passages are quotations from number 1 and number 2 from the Mishnah and Talmud, and then his comment follows in regular font. So Rashi is kind of providing this incredible service, walking the reader through the text, phrase by phrase, with pithy little comments that in a very, very economical use of words express what the text is meaning. So Rashi is an incredible aid to understanding the Talmud. He also wrote an incredible commentary on the Chumash, or the first 5 books of the Torah, as well as the entire Tanakh, actually, that really helps a reader walk through the difficult language at a very, very basic level. And Rashi is, of course, essential to the curriculum in modern Jewish schools. Then number 4 on the outside, and that's actually, they blocked out a lot of different things here, but the actual column that the number 4 appears in, which you can see is sort of like C-shaped, and it wraps around the top and the bottom a little bit, that's actually Tosafot. These are additions to Rashi. And if you look carefully, you'll see that the amount of bolded text is much less than in Rashi, because Tosafot is performing an entirely different function. Tosafot is analyzing the Talmud itself, raising objections, comparing passages elsewhere in the Talmud to the spot on this page and so on, and really taking an entirely different approach to Talmud than Rashi, the predecessor. Tosafot represents, several dozen scholars that lived through roughly the 12th through the 14th centuries, and their ideas are kind of codified in the page here. Now, the other materials around the outside are various other commentators that go all the way from the 10th century up to, it looks like about the 18th century is represented here, and they perform various functions. You'll see my lecture on the Talmud if you're curious about this in a little greater detail. Right, let's go on. So those are 3 very basic things Rishonim. There are dozens more. Now, what exactly did the Rishonim do? What is characteristic of this period in Jewish intellectual history? Well, the first thing I've already alluded to in the previous slide, some of the Rishonim were incredible explainers. They took texts, often ancient texts like the Torah and the Mishnah, and they basically rendered them in more readily understandable Hebrew. Many of those texts are written not in Hebrew. They're written in Aramaic, for example. The Talmud is written in Aramaic. So there was a lot of confusion about the language itself. But more significantly, unpacking the arcane and coded nature of many of these texts, synthesizing the oral and the written tradition. That's especially something that Rashi did tremendously, and generally making the text, which at this point may have been over 1,000 years old, accessible to medieval readers. Nowadays, of course, the decline of generation is certainly true. Many of us require an English translation to access the Rishonim, who are helping us access the original text. But that's essentially what they're doing. If you want a contemporary example, Rashi was, so to speak, the art scroll of his day. That is a phenomenal compliment to art scroll. Right? Rashi was the mediator that made a lot of those ancient texts accessible to medieval readers. Secondly, very importantly, the Rishonim engaged in codification. This is a larger topic. Basically, Jewish law, or halakha, is spread out throughout a massive amount of literature. It's throughout this huge Talmud. There are passages that are derived from the Tanakh, and of course from the Torah itself, and the commentaries of the Gaonim. There are correspondence known as Teshuvot and so on. And a lot of this material, it's just too much for most people to keep in their heads. So therefore, a lot of the Rishonim, most famously perhaps Maimonides, brought all this together and said, look, we're going to reorganize this, and we're going to space it out, give it chapter headings, give it subject headings, so that you can look up in these massive compendiums of Jewish law exactly the law that you want to determine. You don't have to go back through the entire Talmud, which at this point, remember, had not been indexed in any reasonable fashion. The Rishonim did a lot of that really basic legwork of codifying all of that material. Maimonides is, I mentioned, probably one of the most important codifiers of the era. He wrote a book called the Mishneh Torah, 14 volumes of Jewish law. And you have other commentaries which culminate in this work, the Shulchan Aruch, or the set table. This is written at the very end of the period of Rishonim. Some would even consider the author, Rabbi Yosef Karo, and early Acharon. But basically, this is the authoritative code that upon which all later codes have been built. So that's the second major activity of the Rishonim. First is basically they were explainers. Second major issue was they were codifiers of various commandments. And the final area that you find the commentators working on is they are analyzers. For example, one of the areas in which the Rishonim expressed themselves was the area of Minyan HaMitzvot, the counting of the commandments. The Talmud has a passage that says there are 613 commandments, Taryag Mitzvot. That's a lot more than the Big Ten, right? Judaism has a huge amount of commandments. And, like, thou shalt feel guilty. I'm joking, I shouldn't say that. I'm not saying it. So they have all these commandments, but nowhere in the Talmud or in any other text were they ever actually listed. And so many of the commentators in the Rishonim period began to say, okay, well, let's get them all down. What are those 613 commandments? And so Maimonides and others piled these lists. There were some disputes over this is not actually a commandment, this is actually a suggestion, things like that. But basically, one of the major activities is counting the mitzvahs. And in particular, this book, here's a Hebrew English edition published in the 20th century by Feldheim. The Sefer Achina, an amazing work that's written by a later Rishon, probably one Rabbi Aaron of Barcelona, who lived in the 15th century. This is a great book if you want a general introduction to traditional Judaism. Basically what he did was he anonymously wrote this book as a bar mitzvah present. Oh my God. When I was growing up, bar mitzvah presents were fountain pens. My sons generally got things like iPods, but back then in the 15th century, this was an amazing birthday present. It's basically it goes through every parsha of the Torah, the 5 books of Moses as they're divided over the weeks of the year. And in each of those parshiot, the author lists the commandments, adding up to 613, describes how they are performed, a little bit of historical background, and then really interestingly, he talks about why we have this commandment. This is an area of activity that most of the Rishonim shy away from, at least in print. They don't talk about, the commandments are there. God says do it, and that's all there is to it. But the Chinuch was very interested in giving over to his son, as a bar mitzvah present, some inkling as to why these commandments exist. And it's really fascinating reading, especially when you get to the arcane and strange commandments, like, for example, you shall not mix linen and wool together, things like that. Fascinating reading, and definitely very, very worthwhile. Another philosophical activity that's extremely important is that of Maimonides. Again, we're mentioning him over and over again because he is such a towering figure in medieval Jewish history. This is a picture, an illuminated manuscript of his Mora Nevuchim, his Guide to the Perplexed, in which the artist has depicted here Maimonides seated on the right, in which the manuscript of his Mora Nevuchim, his Guide for the Perplexed, in which the artist has depicted here Maimonides seated on the right, wearing tefillin, instructing his students in philosophy. And this is something that only a few of the Rishonim really engaged in, an area which is known in contemporary Hebrew as machshava, as thought, which basically expands on this idea of the why. Why did God create the world the way it's created? Why do we have these obligations? How does it all work, and so on? And the Mora Nevuchim, or the Guide to Perplexed, is one of these great philosophical works, for which, of course, Maimonides was heavily criticized by other Jews, and in fact, his book was even burned in the 13th century. Not a particularly high point in Jewish life. Now, that's basically a quick overview of the Rishonim. We understand them a little better, especially when you contrast them with the later period, the Acharonim. The Rishonim have a pride of place, again, going back to that concept of Yeridat Hadorot, the decline of the generations, because they come earlier than the Acharonim, and their activity, particularly in codification, explaining the text, and so on, they give them a huge pride of place in traditional yeshiva curriculum, generally spend a lot of energy trying to explain the Rishonim, synthesizing their work, and in some cases, adapting their ideas, which are expressed in theory, to novel situations that occur in the contemporary period. Changes in social norms, changes in economic realities, changes in technology in particular, are very much the activity of the Achronim, trying to understand, for example, what does electricity mean when it comes to Shabbat? Can one use distance communication to fulfill a mitzvah like hearing the shofar? All kinds of interesting things like this. That's more the domain of the Achronim, and particularly the later contemporary thinkers, 21st and 20th century as well. So that's a quick overview of who the Rishonim are and what they engage in, and especially fascinating part of Jewish intellectual history. Thanks very much for watching.
chakras, all that fun stuff, clear spaces, people. But I also really believe in being grounded and well-rounded so we can address our humanity. So I really work in the areas of psychology, life coaching, pragmatic ways to really integrate heaven on earth. What was that moment that got you really thinking about God? Goodness, my whole life I have been that person who has heard voices, that's been aware of that realm just beyond ours. And once I started on the spiritual path, left rural Indiana, I really started putting it all together and allowing myself to express what I could always know.
Okay, thank you very much for coming. It was fantastic having you last week at the book launch. I really was very gratified by it. Anyways, thank you. Tonight's lecture on Ibn Gabriel is dedicated by Kay Wiggs, who wants to honor her grandfather, who always told her to look it up. By Mr. Ramilo Matos, and by Barb and Kelly Malikar in memory of Lou and Jenny Ehrlich. As I mentioned to you in a previous class, all of our lectures are actually subscribed. We've got people who donated to the Student Scholarship Fund for the lectures, and that's great. But what I especially like is the fact that people are still giving to the overall scholarship fund, which is amazing. You see, we've got a couple more anonymous grants of $100 and $101. We're now at $10,249, and we've got a few weeks left to hit $100,000. So we'll somehow make it. I also want to give a special thank you, as I mentioned, to those of you who came last week. It was really wonderful. We had a huge crowd. There was a lot of sushi that was consumed, a lot of cookies and things like that. And I think we had a meaningful experience talking about my new book, which is selling really well. I'm pleased to say it feels great to know that many people are appreciating it, and it's getting in the hands of readers who will enjoy it. Also, if you're interested in learning more, I will be having another book signing, this time in the 5 towns. So if you're out in Long Island this Thursday night, it's Kristallnacht. Of course, that's a very important date in the history of the Holocaust. And I'll be speaking about the new book in that context, and I welcome you to come on out or send your friends in the 5 towns to come see it. Okay, so let's go to the material per se. First of all, I want to say something general, and I have to say I'm a little embarrassed about this. You know, I have a PhD, and I've been teaching Jewish history for like 30 years now, and I've always pronounced our subject's name wrong until about 3 weeks ago. When someone pointed out to me, it's not Ibn Gabriel, it's Ibn Gabirol or Gabirol. I put the I in the wrong place. So I changed everywhere that I ever spelled it wrong, but it's Ibn Gabirol, not Gabriel. I was embarrassed. I even said it to a rabbi, and the rabbi corrected me. I felt humiliated, but it's good because it gets rid of my sins for Yom Kippur. Anyway, so we're going to look at Ibn Gabirol. That's our subject for tonight. A fascinating figure who lived a rather troubled life. He's, of course, directly within the period that we've been focusing on for the entire semester, looking at Al-Andalus, and we will continue with Al-Andalus right up until for a couple more weeks, and then we're going to look at the Jews in Christian Spain up until 1492. His dates are roughly 1021 to 22. He was born in Malaga, and then he died in Valencia, although he spent most of his life in Zaragoza, which is kind of central to the Iberian Peninsula. His life was rather short. There's some debate over exactly when he died, but quite likely he died before he reached the age of 40, which in Jewish thought is generally considered a misa meshuna, a strange death. To have to die before the age of 40 is definitely out of the norm. He tremendously prolific. He refers in his own writings to having authored 20 books. Ironically, only 2 of them survived, and one of them was misattributed to another author for the last 1,000 years. And we'll discuss exactly how it was discovered to be actually one of Ibn Gabirol's works. It's rather fascinating. He lived a difficult life. He was orphaned as a young child. He found a patron, and then before he turned 20, the patron died. And he was regarded as a brilliant individual, a fantastic poet, and of course, in Spanish society, poetry was the acme of all virtues. So he had always an audience to attend to his poems, and he had customers for his poems when he was writing them for hire. But he was not well loved for his personality. He was known to be quite irascible, and the greats of that era all spoke of him as this kind of enfant terrible that was, very talented, brilliant even, tremendously prolific. They all had fantastic respect for his poetry and, as we shall see, for his philosophy, but they found his personality very difficult. Even the great Moses Ibn Ezra had some things to say about that. We'll see in a second. But it contributed to the fact that he died alone. He was never able to marry. He was never able to form that kind of relationship with a person, as far as we can tell. And even his supporters, like Shmuel Hanagid, we discussed earlier, wanted to keep him at arm's length because of his difficult personality makeup. Moshe Ibn Ezra writes, although he was a philosopher as far as intellectual attainments were concerned, yet his anger always got the better of his understanding. He was unable to control his temper and was easily led to ridicule great men and to subject them to contempt in his writings. A little bit of a glimpse of the contradictions in Gabriel's personality, because we will read shortly just a little bit of his incredibly refined and passionate religious poetry, in which you see the depth of his personal tshuva, his personal repentance, and his self-awareness, at least in the poetic verse. But his contemporaries report that he had episodes of misanthropy that made it difficult for him to get along with others. Here's a reference from his own poetry. He writes, "When my anger is roused, the heavens rumble with my thunder. I am not like the man who speaks mellow words and bows and scrapes in humility." But a little sense of there's some fire burning there in his personality, a sense of where he comes from. Here's my favorite, though. Check this out. "My light is diffused through the world, yet I am dirt beneath the feet of my true friends." Meaning, if I love you, if you're one of my friends, I'll do anything for you. I'm like dirt between your feet. Just ask whatever you want. I will do it for you. "Dust to those who keep faith with me." Meaning you won't find a more loyal or true associate than I. "But to my enemies, I am a sky raining fire on their heads." And this is in a letter he writes to his former friend. "Now that you have failed me, I untie the bonds of friendship. I blot thy name from my speech, and will never stoop to mention it again. This is a person you don't want to cross. You can see why he would be regarded in this rather negative way. You get a sense of his personality from just a few snippets of the kinds of things that he wrote about this. It's ironic. Let's go straight to the mistaken identity because it's so. There is a great historical irony here in that the contrast between his elevated ethereal writings and his personal inability to control his anger are expressed in this really being outside of the major corpus of great Jewish writers in the area where he was most brilliant, which was his philosophy. Not so much his poetry, in my humble opinion. He's kind of like shunted away from Jewish trajectory for a couple of reasons. The first is the disappearance of, without question, his most famous work, which was called Fons Vitae. There's a cover of one. Fons Vitae means the source of life in Latin. The ironic history of this magnum opus, his philosophical masterwork, is that it did not. He wrote it originally in Arabic, as we've seen many of the Jews in Al-Andalus who wrote their great works in Arabic. Maimonides, of course, writing in Judeo-Arabic. So he's written this book, and he was also, there was a certain level of hubris in his writing in that he wanted to so distance himself from the Judaic tradition that he did not cite any Jewish sources other than the Bible in Fons Vitae. It's written as if, it's just reason and scripture without, any of the rabbinic works, the Midrash, the Talmud, any of the Kabbalistic mystical writings. They're not present in Fons Vitae. It's just quoting scripture, and he's expressing a Neoplatonist philosophy, which I'll describe to you in a couple of slides from now. The Arabic original did not survive the vicissitudes of history. It was not picked up by Jews in any significant way as a core text, like, let's say, Maimonides' writings. But it was, as we saw with Ibn Ezra last week, translated into Latin in the 12th century by one John of Spain. The only thing that we had hanging around that was sort of like it was a 13th century Hebrew version, which only took extracts of it by someone named Shem Tov Ibn Yosef, and it was copied and copied and copied, and the author's name, Ibn Gabiro, was eventually changed to Latin Avicebrol or Avicebron. And so for many, many centuries, until the 1850s, it was believed that this work, which is in Latin, Fons Vitae, was originally written possibly in Latin or maybe in Arabic by some Christian, perhaps, but there was no idea that it was associated with a Jew. There was no association with traditional rabbinic texts, and so it was simply lost. For 800 years, it became incredibly popular with Christians. St. Thomas Aquinas is very much involved with Fons Vitae. It was a core text and runaway popular book with Christians, but Jews are basically forgotten about it. It was in the 19th century. Here's a publication which it is associated now with Ibn Gabiro, but at the time it was famous. It was still Avicebron, like what it says there. Until a 19th century French scholar named Solomon Monk found an abbreviated version of Makor Chaim, which was the Hebrew title, Makor Chaim, the source of life, and he read through it and he said, gee, that sounds a lot like Fons Vitae, and he was able to match them up and then finally associate once and for all, and it's widely accepted now that Gabriel is the author of this core Christian text. And in fact, if you look at many of the covers of the medieval versions of it, you see like huge, pictures of Jesus by a well and things like that. That's the way that Christians appreciate it, even Gabriel, without realizing that the Jew is actually at the authorship of this important work. So it is ironic that, despite his boastful words, which were not out of place in general in the Arabic Jewish culture, he was largely forgotten to his own people in his philosophy. That is not the case, however, with his poetry. In fact, it is through his poetry that he's lived on. Very prolific poet with over 300 poems that have survived. He was very precocious. As a young man, at age 16, he wrote his first famous poem, which rendered all 613 commandments in verse. And we should recall that the Andalusian poets had a special affinity for acrostics, where they spell out words in the first letter of each line and things like that. And it's amazing when you see that the meter works, the rhyme works, and the letters are all absolutely essential to the entire poem. That you could not add another line, you could not take away a line without ruining the entire puzzle. And it's a work of tremendous intellectual gymnastics to be able to put all of these things together into a poem. At age 19, he wrote, following an example set by Sadia Gaon out east, he wrote a poem detailing